At noon, we were strung out in a file along a narrow track with a snow slope on the right going up to the horizon, and on the left, a plunge down into a ravine. The summer of that year had melted away much snow, and stones and boulders were exposed that I suppose were normally covered. The heat of the day continued the melting, and we were alarmed to see many of them starting to roll down the slope at gathering speed, anything from the size of oranges to large footballs, and a few much larger. They were whizzing across our path and plunging into the ravine, hard pounding, ladies and gentlemen. They started slowly, and then usually held a straight line of descent, but the path was rough, and one had also to keep an eye on one's feet. I remember the member of the party just in front of me, an elderly schoolmistress, gave a sudden squeak and jumped forward as a large lump of rock shot between us, about a foot at most from my unmanly knees. Welcome to Shire Reckoning. I'm Alistair Stevens. Today's opening quote comes from letter 306, a letter written by Professor Tolkien to his eldest son, Michael, describing his time in Switzerland in 1911, which he directly attributes as an inspiration, not just for the geography of much of his legendarium. It was clearly a very formative experience for a kid who had previously grown up in the middle of England, but also directly for Bilbo's passage to, over, under, and then through the Misty Mountains. We're going to talk about all of that this week in Chapter 4 of The Hobbit, Over Hill and Under Hill. We're going to have a lot to discuss tonight, or at least we're going to spend a lot of time discussing a few subjects. But before we get to that, a quick thank you for the, frankly, excellent correspondence that I've received this week, which has just been in a tide. A tide has carried your letters and thoughts and missives all the way to me, which has just been absolutely wonderful. I've been very busy this week, but it has been a constant delight to find these messages filtering into my inbox. Particularly, I want to give credit to Matt, who, in addition to some points that I will definitely pick up in later shows, offered answers to two questions that I've been thinking about for the last month or more, I guess. This is episode 10, believe it or not, of Shire Reckoning. So 5 weeks I've been thinking about these. And the topics, the questions rather, are these. What do we call the two halves of the Shire Reckoning show? And how do I address you, the faithful listeners? So on this topic, Matt suggests topic and textual for the Sunday show, and then the usually Tuesday show, respectively. We're a day late and $1 short today, but I hope we'll be able to to get through it in an efficient fashion nonetheless. Topical and textual, which I really like, and the description for the name, the appellation for all of you, and possibly for me too, I don't know if I get to be included in this group, as the Shire Wrecked with a W, which I really like, but I don't get to make this decision. So keep an eye on the Patreon page over the next couple of days for a poll. And if you have alternate theories for what we should all be called, get in touch and let me know. Thank you so much, Matt, for your correspondence. That's enough preamble. Let's get into our topic, because we have two giant, pun intended, two giant things that we have to discuss tonight, and a few things in the middle that hopefully we'll be able to glide over fairly easily. Chris Stevens is joining me in the chat tonight. Chris, good to have you with me tonight. I don't know who's going to make it tonight because of this weird last-minute rearrangement to a Wednesday night. It has thrown my day out completely, I'll tell you that. But good to have you with me, Chris. Let's get right into it then and take a look at how we begin our journey into the Misty Mountains. We're reasserting very powerfully, I think, Bilbo's connection to the natural world, right? After the fairy realm of Rivendell, as we saw in last week's reading, we're now back absolutely resolutely in the geography of Middle-earth, but that geography is going to be challenging and unexpected, not just to Bilbo because he doesn't have a lot of experience when it comes to mountains, but also to the dwarves. And we're going to see exactly how that is personified, how that is represented here initially, because that will help us understand better what comes later. Let's take a look at our first slide here this evening. There were many paths that led up into those mountains and many passes over them, but most of the paths were cheats and deceptions and led nowhere or to bad ends. And most of the passes were infested by evil things and dreadful dangers. The dwarves and the Hobbit, helped by the wise advice of Elrond and the knowledge and memory of Gandalf, took the right road to the right pass. Long days after they had climbed out of the valley and left the last homely house miles behind, they were still going up and up and up. It was a hard path and a dangerous path, a crooked way and a lonely and a long. Now they could look back over the lands that they had left, laid out behind them far below. Far, far away in the west, where things were blue and faint, Bilbo knew there lay his own country of safe and comfortable things, and his little hobbit hole. He shivered. It was getting bitter cold up here, and the wind came shrill among the rocks. Boulders, too, at times came galloping down the mountainsides, let loose by midday sun upon the snow, and passed among them, which was lucky, or over their heads, which was alarming. The nights were comfortless and chill, and they did not dare to sing or talk too loud, for the echoes were uncanny, and the silence seemed to dislike being broken, except by the noise of water and the wail of wind and the crack of stone. So, we have left the last homely house behind. We have left Rivendell behind, and we are now ascending into the Misty Mountains. And even that note of days had passed and still up and up and up is communicating to us, I think, the enormity of the geography in which we find ourselves. I don't know how many of you have real experiences of mountains. My real experience of mountains, I will say, is fairly minor because I grew up in Scotland, and though we are, famed for our highlands, the Highlands are not actually that impressive. It's only really when you get out to the very northwest coast of Scotland that you get the sense of scale, that sense of enormity, that sense of grandeur, and that sense of being very small in a very large landscape, which is a sense that I haven't had that many times in my life. But we see here not just the geographical transformation, though we are carefully, you'll note, positioning the West, right? The West is safe, and we have moved through Rivendell, moved through Fairy into the beginning of the wild. We have left the West behind, but within that notion of the West, though Bilbo's recognizing that his home is a long way out in the West, we're kind of transforming the whole of the West into this very comfortable, very civilized, very stately kind of place, a safer place than we are now in, despite the fact that we, lost the baggage of a pony and encountered the 3 trolls. And I mean, very nearly came to a calamitous conclusion to our adventure long before we even reached Rivendell in the first place. But this adventure is now recontextualizing the adventures before, which is something that we're going to continue to see from Bilbo. I think it's I should have prepared this. I shouldn't have prepared this because we're not going to talk about it until next week anyway, but I believe that Professor Corey Olsen, in his book Exploring J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit, which I know that I've mentioned before and will continue to mention for the duration of this series, I believe it's at the beginning of next week's chapter, Riddles in the Dark, when he observes that Bilbo is at that point in his most dangerous circumstance, I suppose. He is at the point where the maximum level of danger meets the minimum level of preparation and experience. That is the point at which Bilbo is most exposed. The delta between what he can handle and what he is forced to handle is at its widest. Sure, he will face much greater foes and threats later in his story, but it is at that point that the delta between what he knows how to do and what he is faced with is at its absolute widest. But I think that we can see that beginning even here, right? We're now well past the safety of the West, and even the trolls in their semi-civil, right? In their barely civilized quasi-fairy tale kind of role there. We're seeing an adventure that Bilbo feels, at least at the beginning of that adventure, that he can handle it. Now we're well out of his realm of experience. And look at how we're anthropomorphizing also, almost, right? How we're caricaturing, how we are embodying and personifying the mountains, which is, of course, the thing that we will come back to actively in The Lord of the Rings when we start talking about Carathras as a person. We start talking about Carathras as a personality by the time that we're trying to cross the Misty Mountains for the second time in the Legendarium. Third time, I guess, technically Bilbo will come back, but we're going to skim right over that piece of his adventure for sure. So look at how we're opening this landscape up. Most of the paths were cheats and deceptions and led nowhere or to bad ends, and most of the passes were infested by evil things and dreadful dangers. So there are evil things and dreadful dangers out there, but there is also this sense that the landscape itself is antagonistic, that the landscape itself is pushing back against travelers trying to cross it, that the mountain has an awareness, perhaps, right? A hard path, a dangerous path, a crooked way and a lonely and a long, made all the worse by the fact that Bilbo can look back, that he can see what was, and remember, he's getting the best glimpse that he's ever going to get of a direct line, right? Had he but the eyes of Manwë, he could definitely look west and see Bag End right there, but of course he can't. So it's getting colder as we're climbing the mountain, and we're getting these boulders too, kind of personified, right? Galloping down the mountainsides, let loose by the midday sun upon the snow, passing among them, which was lucky, or over their heads, which was alarming. And this oppressive sense that the environment itself has a personality, that the environment itself has desires. The nights were comfortless and chill, and they did not dare to sing or talk too loud, for the echoes were uncanny, right? Kind of the active personification of the wilderness around them. We're getting that sense that their own voices are being reflected back to them. And more uncannily than that, weirder than that, the silence that seems to dislike being broken, except by the noise of water and the wail of wind and crack of stone. So we're already moving toward the idea that there is a presence, a consciousness, a personality here within the Misty Mountains, which is not at all unusual, right? That is a very common feature of fairy tales. It's a very common feature of human psychology, right? We fall all the time into thinking of the landscape in terms of human emotion, the landscape in terms of the pathetic fallacy, that we imbue in these things which do not possess emotionality, the sense of emotionality, right? We want to credit everything in the universe with possessing the same kind of emotional palette as we ourselves possess. And when we feel insecure or vulnerable, we tend to externalize that out to the environment around us. So there is certainly an element of that happening here, right? The dwarves and Bilbo are uncomfortable, so they externalize that discomfort into a world that seems to them jagged and dangerous and antagonistic. But we're also definitely dealing with the sense of the landscape itself, the wild, the capital W wild itself, already beginning to take shape in a way that is going to be consistent as we move through the rest of the book. Galadriel Becky joining us here live in the chat. Hi, Galadriel Becky. Good to have you with me tonight. So, with all of that said, we note here even the good plans of wise wizards like Gandalf and of good friends like Elrond go astray sometimes when you're off on dangerous adventures over the edge of the wild, and Gandalf was a wise enough wizard to know it. I love taking the moment here to credit to Gandalf a wisdom that is coupled with a humility, right? That these paths can be dangerous no matter who you are. And I like crediting Elrond as a good friend. I'm not sure that that's like completely 100% justified, but it works at least. Okay, let's get into the first of our two major topics tonight. And I'm sure that if you've heard me talk about this book at all, you know exactly what is coming, but there's no way that we can get by it without talking about it. So here we go. He knew that something unexpected might happen, and he hardly dared to hope that they would pass without fearful adventure over those great tall mountains with lonely peaks and valleys where no king ruled. They did not. All was well, until one day they met a thunderstorm. More than a thunderstorm, a thunder battle. You know how terrific a really big thunderstorm can be down in the land and in a river valley, especially at night when two great thunderstorms meet and clash. More terrible still are thunder and lightning in the mountains at night, when storms come up from east and west and make war. The lightning splinters on the peaks, and rocks shiver, and great crashes split the air and go rolling and tumbling into every cave and hollow, and the darkness is filled with overwhelming noise and sudden light. Bilbo had never seen or imagined anything of the kind. They were high up in a narrow place with a dreadful fall into a dim valley on one side of them. They were sheltering under a hanging rock for the night, and he lay beneath a blanket and shook from head to toe. When he peeped out in the lightning flashes, he saw that across the valley the stone giants were out, and were hurling rocks at one another for a game, and catching them and tossing them down into the darkness, where they smashed among the trees far below, or splintered into little bits with a bang. Then came a wind and a rain, and the wind whipped the rain, and the hail about in every direction, so that an overhanging rock was no protection at all. Soon they were getting drenched, and their ponies were standing with their heads down and their tails between their legs, and some of them were whinnying with fright. They could hear the giants guffawing and shouting all over the mountainsides. So this is, as I foreshadowed, where we are going to spend at least half of this week's session, because it's one of the elements of The Hobbit about which I feel the most passionate. And while I am pretty sure that I am right in my interpretation, which I'm going to lay out for you here, my intent here isn't to persuade anyone, right? That's not how good literary arguments work. I am offering up an interpretation which to me seems to best fit my understanding of this text. If it seems convincing to you, you are welcome to it. If it doesn't, that is fine too. Lots of people that I respect feel very differently about this part of the book. But here is my thesis, provocatively worded. Giants aren't real. Or, if I'm being at least partly technical, right? These giants aren't real. And if such legalism is the last refuge of the cowardly, then I will be more bold, right? Within the published work of Tolkien's Legendarium, it seems to me that there is no such thing as stone giants. This raises an interesting question here, or perhaps the more interesting question. Is Bilbo creating these giants for the purposes of the story, or does Bilbo think that they are real? And I'm going to back up these bold assertions with some research. Now, our first mention of giants in The Hobbit as it's published comes, in fact, all the way back at the beginning of the story, right? When Gandalf is, I guess, reintroducing himself to Bilbo by the door to Bag End, Bilbo remembers, quote, "Not the fellow who used to tell such wonderful tales at parties about dragons and goblins and giants and the rescue of princesses and the unexpected luck of widows' sons?" End quote. which is interesting because, of course, it situates giants alongside dragons and goblins, both confirmed to be very terrifyingly real within this story, but also conflating those stories with the fairy tale elements of princesses and widows' sons, right? Indeed, in earlier versions of the manuscript, per John Ratliff's excellent history of the Hobbit, which I'm also, I guess, mentioning every week here, princesses were being rescued explicitly from unlamented giants. That's how the first draft of the manuscript went. The princesses were not being listed aside from dragons and goblins and giants, but were being explicitly rescued from unlamented giants. And there were, I should acknowledge, giants in the very early stages of Tolkien's writing on the Legendarium, right? Which shouldn't surprise us at all, given the presence of giants in many of the sources from which Tolkien was drawing active inspiration. Let's take a look. I just got some, just to break it up here, I got some art here to enjoy. This is Fafnir and Fasolt seizing Freya in Arthur Rackham's illustration to Wagner's The Ring of the Nibelung, which of course is written in 1876, the cycle of 4 German language epic dramas, right? Tolkien, I should asterisk this, at least as far as I am aware, did not care for Wagner at all. At least he fiercely rejected the idea that The Lord of the Rings was derivative of the Ring cycle. There is a book, I'm hesitating now because I do not remember the title of this book. There is a book, is the book by Vink, maybe 10 years old, Renee Vink, I think, that maybe talks about the connections between and the compares and contrasts, if you will, Tolkien and Wagner. I have been meaning to read that book for a long time now. I will track down the title and link that in the show notes. So here we see, right, the Jotun of Norse stories, the Jotun of the Anglo-Saxon. And there are a couple of references to giants in Tolkien's earliest writings, used as what I take to be metaphors in the Lay of Leithian, the earliest version of the story of Beren and Luthien. Giants are counted alongside the orcs and the trolls as beings of evil created by Melkor before Tolkien repositions Melkor as corruptive rather than capable of his own creation. In the first version of the Legendarium, and we'll circle back to this later in tonight's discussion, orcs are created from the mud and the slime of the world by Melkor. He creates them in imitation, in parody of the children of Iluvatar. Tolkien later decides that no, actually evil is not capable of its own acts of creation, only of acts of perversion. So he resituates the orcs in a way that we will discuss later in tonight's show. The most striking example of the most striking example of a giant comes in the early preparatory work for The Lord of the Rings, where Tolkien proposes that a giant capture Frodo during his quest while Frodo is looking, I believe, for the other hobbits who have gone missing, or that it is a giant rather than Saruman who captures Gandalf. In both of those cases, Tolkien is thinking of the same giant. He's thinking of a race, an individual belonging to a race named for the Old English word for giant. This individual is Treebeard the Ent. Ent is just an Old English evolution of the word Eotun, right, which is the Anglo-Saxon version of Jotun, the Norse giant. Remember when Sam is drinking at the Green Dragon back at the beginning of The Lord of the Rings and he says, but what about those tree men, those giants as you might call them, right? That is an acknowledgement that the Ents are or were giants in Tolkien's original conception. And Treebeard, obviously, changes form radically through the writing of the book. Before he turns into Treebeard, Tolkien decides that he should be perhaps a benevolent giant instead of a mean giant. And we never get actual manuscript pages featuring that version of the giant in either case. In The Lord of the Rings, as it's published, therefore, there are only a handful of references to giants. From Sam, in the context of fairy tales, we use the word explicitly a couple times to refer to Ents. Frodo uses the word when he sees the Argonath, which is just fantastic, right? The huge carved statues of Isildur and Anarion on the river Anduin. And then we get 2 metaphorical references to giants building both the Hornburg at Helm's Deep and Minas Tirith too, though we're actually crediting the Númenóreans. They're the men of the West rather than actual giants, because what Tolkien is doing there is positioning the narrative voice in a medievalist perspective. There was this idea through the medieval period as the inhabitants of Western Europe in particular could look out upon the landscape and see a landscape that they completely understood, studded with the ruins of Roman conquest, which they absolutely could not understand. And in Anglo-Saxon, in Old English, I believe, we refer to those as Enta Eorc, right? Those were the products of giants. They were giants' work out there on the landscape. Glorfin David joining us live in the chat as I look over for the first time in about 10 minutes to see that I have things that I must catch up with. Chris Stevens says, I've always struggled working stone giants into the larger legendarium, real creatures or Bilbo's literary license or imagination. Chris, that's exactly where we are. I would love to hear where you come down on the end of this discussion. And Galadriel Becky says, I always thought the giants were real, but I never liked them much. They seemed out of place in the story, maybe because none of our characters actually interact with them. Becky, you're going to find yourself in good company with that conclusion. Tom Shippey in The Road to Middle-earth. I pulled this quote for a little later, but we can get to it right now. Tom Shippey in The Road to Middle-earth says, giants never enter the Tolkien universe again. Gandalf accepts their existence for a second in chapter 7, and the passage is a failure of tone. It reads like an old interpretation of giants as nature myth, i.e. personifications of the avalanche like Thor and his hammer personifying thunder and lightning. This is too allegorical for Middle-earth. So says the very well-respected and somewhat grumpy Tom Shippey in another book that I guess I'm just referencing all the same books every single week here, right? So we can also, I think, kind of drawing from that, I'm going to change my slide. I'm going to show you this slide that I pulled from, of course, the Peter Jackson movies, which I'll talk about in just a moment. There is also a perilous line of argument. It's the kind of line of argument that I would not make if we were discussing the work of any other author, but it is the kind of line of argument that one can so often apply to Tolkien's work because of the depth of his thought and work on these subjects. But I think that in this case, we might be able to derive, how do we say it, evidence of absence from the absence of evidence, right? Because The Lord of the Rings so carefully and deliberately repositions the trolls, for example, right, as a different kind of threat. We engage with the trolls creatively and thoughtfully, kind of repositioning them within the tonality of The Lord of the Rings, separate from the tonality of The Hobbit, in this more serious, grown-up work. The orcs, too, are distinct from the goblins that we meet in this chapter. Not really distinct, we'll talk about that in a minute, but they are presented very differently. But there's no mention of the stone giants of the Misty Mountains in the pages of The Lord of the Rings. We get the personification, as I said, of Carathras, right? Much as we get the personification of the mountains at the beginning of this chapter, but we don't reckon with the presence of huge boulder-throwing creatures in the mountains, which, considering how carefully Tolkien develops the world around the core story, is surprising. So as I say, Tom Shippey writes it off completely. He says that it fundamentally doesn't work, and he credits to this scene this idea of something that we discussed back when we were discussing the Silmarillion, right? The etiological myth. It is an explanatory myth. Why are there storms in the mountains? Oh, it is because gigantic stone giants are hurling boulders around and laughing with each other and playing sport, right, in the mountains themselves. Douglas Anderson, in the annotated Hobbit, comes to the conclusion that the giants are real, and that they are probably a kind of troll, larger, perhaps, than the three that we've already dealt with, but similarly connected to rock and stone. I don't completely follow that line of logic, but here we are. And John Ratliff notes in the history of The Hobbit, the stone giants of The Hobbit do not seem to be aware of the presence of the travelers, but then again, there's no indication that they would have behaved any differently had they known. In short, they are portrayed as a perilous but almost impersonal force, rather like the thunderstorm itself, which is exactly where I am, but I'm not sure why Ratliff then does not take the obvious next step of seeing them as not just seeming like a personification of the storm, but actually being a personification of the storm. And I'm not, how do I put this? I'm not innately opposed to the inclusion of giants in the setting, right? If you've accompanied me through the Silmarillion over on Stars and Swords, I am fascinated by those creatures which do not seem to fit in Tolkien's aesthetic arrangement, that do not seem to fit according to our understanding of his own cosmology, right? Ungoliant, I think, is a prominent example. The Watcher in the Water, Goldberry and Tom Bombadil are excellent examples too. They don't completely fit our understanding of how this created world works. So I'm not against the inclusion of the giants on the grounds of I don't know, categorical rigor, right? I'm not bothered by them because they don't fit the taxonomy, but rather because the metaphors are much more powerful. It isn't clear to me whether Bilbo here terrified, right? Never more aware of the overwhelming enormity of the world around him. It isn't clear to me if Bilbo in this moment is genuinely, right, huddled under his blanket, shivering from head to toe, as we're told, if he is genuinely imagining these stone giants across the way, if he is really seeing them in this moment and then reporting them later, or if he is trying to evoke the feeling of being in the storm in a way that is accessible to his junior readers. It's a game, it's fun, it is at worst a kind of mischief, which completely connects to the account that we get right at the beginning of the slide that we just had, right, where Tolkien, through Bilbo, kind of positions the audience very directly with regard to the storm. That is to say, you know how bad storms can be when you're on flat land or you're in a river valley, and when two storms crash together, well, that's all the more worse. But up in the mountains, it's something else. We're getting... And we do this frequently throughout the entire Misty Mountains portion of our story, by the way. We're going to talk about the goblins knowing their way as well as you know the way down the road to your post office, right? That is another way of engaging with the, in that case, clearly modern, well, maybe not clearly modern, actually. I guess the Shire mail service, does not have post offices in the way that Tolkien would have understood them, or that seems to be the case. But there is an active mail service in the Shire, so we're told. So maybe it's not that much of a stretch after all. But Tolkien is clearly engaging with the juvenile reader of The Hobbit in a way that is prioritizing your real world experience and thus detracting from the more terrifying aspects of the story as we move through. That seems to be part of the strategy. So I'm not sure if that's Bilbo doing that or if that's Tolkien doing that or exactly where we draw that line, but that is the line that I am drawing. I've taken down the slide now. You know what? I'm going to put it back up because why not? I was so confident going into the Peter Jackson films that we weren't going to get the Stone Giants, specifically because, in fact, of that tonal problem that they present. I assumed that they would be omitted because they would fit so uncomfortably with the Misty Mountains that we've already seen in the Lord of the Rings movies. I was hopeful, wide-eyed innocent that I was, that we would get the metaphor, that we would get the ambiguity, that we would get the flashes of lightning and a real tight close-up on Bilbo's face as he looks across and he sees something that might ambiguously be a giant stone creature hurling a boulder, or might just be the flank of the mountain, right? I kind of really hoped that we would play in that space, and we sure didn't. We're not going to talk a lot about the movies this week, but I think that we're talking about Glorfin David is observing that they look like Rock'em Sock'em robots, which I think is very astute here. Yeah. We're not going to spend a lot of time talking about the movies, or the movie, I should say, the first Hobbit film in this week's reading, because this is the least successful part of the entire film, I think. The combination of the storm and the stone giants and everything that happens, the roller coaster ride through Goblin Town, I think is basically calamitous, particularly when contrasted with the absolutely excellent Riddles in the Dark sequence that we will discuss the book version of next week. So, Bilbo and the others take refuge in a cave. That's how far we've come. And we get this. At that, he woke up with a horrible start and found that part of his dream was true. A crack had opened at the back of the cave and was already a wide passage. He was just in time to see the last of the pony's tails disappearing into it. Of course, he gave a very loud yell as a yell as a hobbit can give, which is surprising for their size. Out jumped the goblins. Big goblins. Great ugly-looking goblins. Lots of goblins. Before you could say rocks and blocks. There were 6 to each dwarf, at least, and 2 even for Bilbo. And they were all grabbed and carried through the crack before you could say tinder and flint. But not Gandalf. Bilbo's yell had done that much good. It had wakened him up wide in a splintered second, and when goblins came to grab him, there was a terrific flash like lightning in the cave, a smell like gunpowder, and several of them fell dead. One of the interesting elements here that is simultaneously one of the most provocative moments in our understanding of The Hobbit vis-a-vis the Silmarillion, right? In our desire to situate The Hobbit in terms of the Silmarillion and to understand what is really, really real and what is metaphorically real within these pages, what is a fiction that is pointed at the truth rather than the literal truth of Bilbo's experience. This is one of those moments which really tests our ability to, well, reconcile what is happening on the one hand and just speculate wildly, of course, because one possible interpretation here, after, Fili and Kili have gone to find the sheltered cave and we've led the ponies in, and the dwarves and Gandalf have talked for a good long time. They have lit their pipes. They are smoking. They are talking about how they are going to spend the treasure, which hubris thy name is dwarf. We then have this moment of falling asleep and Bilbo getting what we would take, I think, fresh from the Silmarillion as we are, to be a classic Silmarillion prophetic dream. The kind of dream that appears all the way through the Silmarillion, all the way through the Lord of the Rings too, to be honest, but which is otherwise absent from The Hobbit. And that's where I falter. That's where I stop, because I don't know what we do next with that. Is Bilbo's dream prophetic? Yeah, maybe. Sure could be. Is it a warning from Ulmo, from Aule, Lord of Mountains and Stone? Is it a warning from the West? Is it some kind of intrusion into Bilbo's experience to arm Gandalf so that he can unleash whatever it is that he's unleashing, whether you read it as a powerful magical spell or a prepared little sack of black powder or, a firearm. That is a joke. I do not want to see pictures of Gandalf with a gun. I'm just going to put that out there on the internet. Thanks so much. Don't ever need to see that. Feeling pretty good about it. Thanks so much. Don't need a bumper sticker of Gandalf with a deagle. That is not. Although the pun is. Oh, is it worth it for the? It's not worth it for the pun. It's not worth it for the pun for sure. Yeah, Chris is asking actual gunpowder or magic. It's tempting to speculate that it is actual gunpowder, right? I don't think that we have cause to believe that Gandalf's fireworks, for which he is so rightly famous, are complete artifacts of magic. That they are themselves inherently arcane, right? I think that we can assume that there are actual fireworks because otherwise I don't follow the cognitive reasoning, the cognitive path that gets us to fireworks if a wizard is just standing there blasting firebolts and magic missiles into the air, right? I think that we're supposed to understand that they are something that we would recognize, that the juvenile audience of Tolkien's book in 1937 would recognize as fireworks. So I think Gandalf probably carries some gunpowder. I think he probably carries like some crude black powder with him that he can just throw down like a flashbang whenever he needs to. Again, I'm really trying to avoid the idea that Gandalf would be super good in Call of Duty, but it seems inevitable that we're going to wind up there. So, moment of prophetic dream or not, but more importantly, we get the trap, right? The goblins close the door. The goblins open the crack, I suppose, and capture our party. I love how we reiterate here. Out jumped the goblins, big goblins, great ugly looking goblins, lots of goblins before you could say rocks and blocks. These paired, we get rocks and blocks, we get flint and tinder here too. These almost childish just pairs of not even pairs of rhyming words, right? Sometimes rhyming words and sometimes just like connected nouns. We do this a lot through this chapter. It's interesting that we get a sequence of these simple opposed and pairs as we move through. We'll talk about that perhaps a little more when we get to the Goblin song, which in fact we should do right now because I'm looking at the time and we should talk about the Goblin song. Here we go. Clap, snap, the black crack, grip, grab, pinch, nab, and down, down to Goblin Town you go, my lad. Clash, crash, crush, smash, hammer and tongs, knocker and gongs, pound, pound for underground, ho ho, my lad. Swish, smack, whip, crack, batter and beat, yammer and bleat, work, work, nor dare to shirk, while goblins cough and goblins laugh, round and round for underground below, my lad. So before we talk about the song, we have to talk about the singing. And before we talk about the singing, we have to talk about the singers. And before we talk about the singers, I want to ask an open question because I have never been able to find an answer that satisfies me here. Tolkien has an amazing ear for rhyme. As we saw last week in our discussion of the Elf song, the Down in the Valley song, right? He has an amazing ability and a great discipline when it comes to rhyme. And I want to know, in which regional dialect ought we to read the voices of the goblins where we can find quaff and laugh rhyming? What do we have to do to the pronunciation of those A sounds to get a rhyme there in the middle of that line? Because the only way that I can read that is that it is intended to communicate something about the dialectic representation of the dwarves, right? The dialectual representation of the dwarves. So if you have any ideas on that, let me know. But I've tried most of the accents that I can think of, and I can't get to it. So I don't know if there's anything out there that fits the brief as far as this goes. So, as I say, the singing and the singers. We probably don't need to spend too long on this in this particular milieu because I think it's pretty well known by most Tolkien readers that there isn't a difference between goblins and orcs, right? Even in this book, it's clear that there isn't a difference. The word orcs is used twice in this book to signify particularly large, well-muscled goblins, right? Plus, it is used in the name of the sword Orcrist, goblin cleaver, right? We get the direct orc means goblin, could not be made more clear than the title of that particular sword. And then when we get to the Lord of the Rings, the word goblin is used interchangeably with orcs throughout that book, most notably during the departure of Boromir and the journey of Merry and Pippin across to Isengard, all the way across Rohan to Isengard. And it makes sense that these two words are used somewhat interchangeably, and it makes sense that Tolkien pivots from one to the other between The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, because the word goblin comes to us from the German word kobold, meaning a mischievous or vindictive supernatural creature, a fairy, right? Some kind of house sprite there, right? That word kobold comes into French as gobel, where it picks up a diminutive suffix and becomes goblin. So a French word coming into English as a loan word, that's how we get to goblins. Orcs, by contrast. Orc is a much weirder word, and I wish that I had had more time to dig into this, and this might be... I might just link out in the show notes next week or in some future episode with more research on this, because I haven't conducted, what I feel to be a sufficient amount of dedicated research to this, but it's a really great story. The word orc in Old English means a metal cup, and that is all that it means. But there is a particular 11th century glossary of Old English and Anglo-Saxon. And in that glossary, the entry on the word orc is somehow mixed and conflated, combined with the entry on the word thurs, which is a kind of giant, a kind of a jotun, right? The jotun kind of comes down into Old English with thors. Scholars looking back at this glossary centuries later, therefore understood the word orc to have two meanings, a cup or, a giant monster. This, because there were so few primary sources, was widely reprinted by people assembling dictionaries through the 18th and the 19th centuries, which is presumably where Tolkien encountered it. So part of the shift here, and what's even wilder about this, is that it seems as though after that mistake is made and people start drawing upon that odd glossary as a primary source itself, that the word orc comes back into Old English with people going back to original sources and kind of retranslating them, which is crazy. So part of the shift here, as Tolkien would have understood it, is the move from the accessible but slightly more juvenile, slightly more modern French-inflected word goblin to the older, more obscure, more English word orc. In Sindarin, brilliantly, the plural of orc, right, O-R-C-H in Sindarin, the plural is irch, Y-R-C-H, just one of my favorite words in all of Sindarin. Later in his life, Tolkien also favored spelling orc with a K at the end rather than a C. It seems just to prevent misunderstandings when it came to how to pronounce the word, though I don't know that there are many people out there calling them orses or something similar. I think that the spelling with the K is now pretty universally associated with Games Workshop and the Warhammer setting. Galadra Becky's pointing out, oh my god, a metal cup is also a goblet, and the connection between goblet and goblin. Wow, I would need to give some thought to what on... Oh, you're tempted. Okay, we'll put an asterisk next to that. In Last Call at the Green Dragon, the after show for tonight's session, if you're joining me over on the Patreon exclusive show that I do every night after we finish one of these live sessions, we will look up the etymology of goblet and see if there's a story there to be told. Some scholars out there try to identify geographical differences in the kinds of goblins/orcs that we get, different subgroups, different tribes, but I'm not sure that there's enough in the text, there's enough precision in the text for me to be really moved by those. There is a difference between the orcs as we understand them and the Uruk-hai of Saruman and the half-orcs and the orc men that we see later too, but your regular orcs, these are your regular orcs right here beneath the Misty Mountain, right? Beneath the Misty Mountains, excuse me. We can be pretty sure of a continuation of not just identity, but culture, for reasons which, in fact, we'll come back to that in just a moment, because we're going to talk about the song that they sing and where else we hear that song. We should, first of all, I suppose, if we're going to talk about orcs, acknowledge their odd place in the legendarium. The most common version of the story as we understand it, as it survives Tolkien's creative process. Famously, he kept returning to the story and trying to reconfigure it so that it would fit better his understanding of the moral universe in which he set his stories, is that the orcs were originally elves taken by Melkor before the elves received the invitation to go to the west, right? Before the Valar are even aware of the elder children of Iluvatar, Melkor is already out there in the darkness, kidnapping them and twisting them, corrupting them, turning them into orcs, and then commanding them to breed, because they still can, so that he can have this immense army over which he has to expend relatively little power. That's one of the great advantages of the orcs, is that they are still, though they are corrupted by Melkor, though they are under his sway, he doesn't have to directly imbue them with power the way that he does the dragons, for example, right? Or Ungoliant when he seeks to kill the two trees. So that raises innumerable questions about the orcs themselves, whether the orcs have souls, whether the orcs have culture and identity, whether it is okay morally to kill them. Is there a hope of redeeming the orc? What happens to the orc soul, if indeed the orc has a soul, after the moment of death? I'm led to believe that Rings of Power, the Amazon series, is confronting some of these questions. I have no idea how they are addressing them or to what degree they're being effective. As I say, I still haven't seen the bulk of that series. I obviously have to now, right? It's frankly getting ridiculous that I'm hosting this Tolkien podcast twice a week and I haven't even made time to watch that show, so I need to do that. But the orcs remain an absolutely open question. As Tolkien's writing this book, he's not really thinking, though, about whether these orcs, these goblins as we meet them, are the product of the mud and slime, right? The product of an actual act of creation by Melkor, or corrupted elves, or just a kind of fairy tale monster. They kind of occupy all three of those positions simultaneously. But the singing is therefore made more relevant, more important, more significant in our understanding of who these creatures are. This week I received an email from Travis who says, I'm just going to read this excerpt directly because Travis sends excellent emails and this was a particularly thought-provoking one. Travis writes, quote, "I'm actually really excited to hear your perspective on the Goblin song in the next episode, especially after the deep dive into the philosophy presented in the Silmarillion. For my money, this is indisputable evidence that the goblins/orcs are children of Iluvatar. This is the creation of art. This is culture. This demonstrates personality. From my understanding of the cosmology of the Legendarium, this is only possible if it flows directly from Iluvatar." I know you've discussed this before and Tolkien himself struggled with the topic, but here is textual evidence. And I'll say broadly, almost completely, in fact, I agree with you, Travis. I think that that is what we are seeing here. And it's not too thin a thread for us to speculate. We can take this further. We have other canonical sources that we can turn to, that we can reference, that we can use to support this argument. I don't have to just dismiss this one like the Stone Giants for a lack of evidence. We have these deeper canonical sources. In the choices of Master Samwise in the Two Towers, we are told that, quote, "There was a wild clamor, hooting and laughing as something was lifted from the ground. Yahoy! Yahari hoy! Up, up!" Which doesn't just suggest a kind of boisterous singing, a kind of communal activity of the sort that we see here, but as I noted earlier, might in fact suggest a continuity of culture between the orcs of the Misty Mountains, echoing with that Yahoy, Yahari hoy, right? The Yahé, Yahari hey, Yahoy that we get in the second of the Goblin poems in The Hobbit. We're going to see that in chapter 6 when the goblins are pursuing our heroes into pine trees. Right at the end of that chapter too, right? Right at the end of the choices of Master Samwise, right before the great doors slam shut and Sam realizes that Frodo has been taken, we are also told, quote, "Sam heard a burst of horse singing, blaring of horns and banging of gongs, a hideous clamor. Gorbag and Shagrat were already on the threshold." And that is not all either. We get Aragorn and Theoden hearing harsh singing from the army of Saruman on their way to Helm's Deep. Merry's telling the story of the sack of Isengard when he also notes that Saruman's forces are singing in both of those cases. Right, asterisk there in both of those cases. There are probably Dunlendings or other, evil men in the mix, but such a distinction isn't made. So I am reading it as the orcs too are singing, and that is, as Travis points out here, culture. It's language, and this is further confirmed in this book when we learn that the goblins, as we meet them, don't just sing. Right, they're not just singing in the present tense about what is happening. They also have an oral tradition. They have a storytelling culture. They know the names of Orcrist and Glamdring. They know the names of Beater and Biter, right? Which are sophisticated enough that they're rough cognates for the Sindarin names, okay? So Orcrist is Goblin Cleaver, kind of a biter. You can see how that works. Glamdring, Foehammer, Beater. You can see the connection there too. It seems as though there is a real goblin culture at work here. I would hesitate only, I think, and this may be a topic for a future show, I may hesitate only in the extension of this argument to include or to situate the orcs as we see them here as being children of Iluvatar. I think that it doesn't completely resolve the irresolvable questions of orcdom that Tolkien also struggled with through his entire career. I think that we're still stuck here because I'm not sure that you can completely disassociate the desire to create how can I put that? I guess I'll flip that around, right? I'm not sure that you necessarily entangle the desire to subcreate with the light of Iluvatar. I think that perhaps you could argue that there are two desires there, or a desire and a source. The desire could still exist without that source. I'm not sure about that. I would need to give that much more thought. But an excellent point and an excellent proof, yes, that the goblins, at least as we're treating them here in The Hobbit, well, they're getting the same treatment as both dwarves and elves. I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but it's wild that the dwarves show up and the first thing they do is sing a song. The elves show up and the first thing they do is sing a song. And the goblins show up and the first thing that they do is sing a song that tells us a great deal about who they are. Let's get into a quick analysis here of the... Glorfin David's telling us, both terms are derived from a Latin root with goblin ultimately tracing back to the Greek word kobolos, meaning rogue or knave. Is that the origin of kobold in the German? That's fascinating. Thank you for that, Glorfin David. That's genuinely fascinating. I'm into that. Galadra Becky is saying, orcs, I think, are the biggest problem in Tolkiendom. Seems hard to believe that Melkor could corrupt the elves to the point of having them on his side. Well, is it? I mean, Sauron could corrupt, the great kings of Numenor. I guess 3 of the 9 are great lords of Numenor, but he corrupts them about as much as somebody can corrupt somebody. And add to that, of course, the corruptive power of Melkor over... the other Maiar that join him, Sauron included, right? But also the Balrogs and many others too. I think that Melkor is capable of huge cruelty and depravity, right? We'll remember that when we're talking about his corruption of the orcs, that it is positioned as the worst thing that Melkor ever does. It is just the worst thing, and it's generations of suffering from that point on. And it's one of those things that isn't incompatible with our understanding that we only see male orcs on the page, that we only see male orcs on the screen of the film adaptations. It's not incompatible with that. It's all too compatible with that. It's actually, there is a very clear inference, I think, being made by the fact that we only ever seem to see male orcs, and that is awful. And yeah, again, I'm curious to see what the Rings of Power will do with that. I'm actually astonished that the Rings of Power, an Amazon series, kind of has the moral gumption to tackle the biggest question in all of Tolkien. So I'm looking forward to seeing how they handle it. Yeah. Let's see how we do with our poem here as we go back to it. So, setting all of the cultural stuff aside, let's take a look at the song that I always refer to as Down Down to Goblin Town, but is more properly known as Clap, Snap, the Black Crack. We see here a lot of active verbs, right? We see here a lot of monosyllables, particularly in those first 2 lines, right? Clap, snap, the black crack, grip, grab, pinch, nab. Monosyllabic, immediate, kind of onomatopoeic even, right? We begin in the present here too, or I guess not the immediate present, in the very recent past is where we begin. We're describing the capture of the dwarves and Bilbo. Clap, snap, the black crack, grip, grab, pinch, nab, right? So the black crack opens, we grab the dwarves and we lead them down to Goblin Town. You go, my lad, right? What do we find in Goblin Town? How do we reposition ourselves here in the second, what we might think of as a stanza? Clash, crash, crush, smash, hammer and tongs, knocker and gongs, pound, pound for underground, ho, ho, my lad. This seems to suggest that the dwarves are being led into a life of work, a life of slavery. This is confirmed by our last stanza. Swish, smack, whip, crack, batter and beat, yammer and bleat, work, nor dare to shirk while goblins quaff and goblins laugh, round and round far underground below, my lad. Now, what I find most interesting about this poem, apart from its direct emotive qualities, right? Apart from its kind of obvious, literal, poetic power here, right? We get this idea that we are learning something about the goblins from their song in the way that we learned about the dwarves from their song and the elves from their song. There's all of this immediacy. There is a lack of elegance. There's a lack of even ambition, right? The meter is forced and rhythmic, but it's also inconstant. It's nothing like the complicated meter that we saw from the elves. It does share, well, you know what? Let's get to it, because the conclusion that I think you are being led to here, and the conclusion that is absolutely confirmed with a slide that we will discuss in just a moment, is that the goblins and the dwarves, they're not so alike, you and I, because we get first here, hammer and tongs, knocker and gongs, pound, pound far underground, which always makes me think of the line from the Misty Mountains Cold song, right? The dwarves of yore made mighty spells, while hammers fell like ringing bells in places deep where dark things sleep in hollow halls beneath the fells. You can even feel some of that same rhythm. While hammers fell like ringing bells, hammer and tongs, knocker and gongs. It could almost fit the same meter. It doesn't quite, but it could almost fit the same meter. But that's one point of similarity. The real point of similarity comes here as we juxtapose clap, snap, the black, crack, and chip the glasses and crack the plates. Because what we see are enormous similarities here. Not only are they exactly the same length in terms of the number of lines, as you can very easily see here on this slide, but we're using a lot of the same active onomatopoeic verbs. We're using the same patterning here with the same pattern of first and last syllables of each line are stressed, right? Clash, crash, crush, smash, cut the cloth and tread on the fat, right? We're still seeing that same echo of stresses at the beginnings and the ends of each line, this strong rhythm. We repeat the words crack and smash and pound, these active, destructive verbs. We get the same kind of echo all the way through it. So this seems to me to be a pretty strong indication that we're supposed to be kind of co-positioning the dwarves and the goblins in our own heads from Bilbo's perspective, right? From the comfort of the Hobbit hole, although it is interesting, I suppose, that hobbits and dwarves and goblins all, as far as we know within the bounds of this book, completely, or quasi-subterranean, let's say that. It does seem to me that one of the effects of this first poem is to evoke and to echo the dwarf song that we've already seen. I'm looking uncomfortably at the time and realizing, we're going to skip ahead. We do, we acknowledge that the ponies are going to pass out of the story at this point because they're definitely going to be eaten by the goblins. We lose everything that we have been carrying with us, all of our packs and baggage. There is an interesting detail, and I think that I was guilty of this too when we first sat down to discuss The Hobbit, whatever that was, 4 weeks ago, I guess, when we were looking at the first chapter. And I was talking about the dwarves' musical instruments and where do they come from and where do they go. Well, this would be the indisputable answer to where do they go. If indeed if indeed the dwarves are carrying the musical instruments that they took with them to Bag End in the first place, this is where they vanish into what we can only assume is an ever-growing goblin horde. Let's take a look then at the last slide that we have tonight, which is the direct comparison, right? If you're feeling as though you're being led to compare goblins and dwarves, good news, the narrative is going to do it all but explicitly. There in the shadows on a large flat stone sat a tremendous goblin with a huge head, and armed goblins were standing round him carrying the axes and bent swords that they used. Now goblins are cruel, wicked, and bad-hearted. They make no beautiful things, but they make many clever ones. They can tunnel and mine as well as any but the most skilled dwarves when they take the trouble, though they are usually untidy and dirty. Hammers, axes, swords, daggers, pickaxes, tongs, and also instruments of torture they make very well, or get other people to make to their design, prisoners and slaves that have to work till they die for want of air and light. It is not unlikely that they invented some of the machines that have since troubled the world, especially the ingenious devices for killing large numbers of people at once, for wheels and engines and explosions always delighted them, and also not working with their own hands more than they could help. But in those days and those wild parts, they had not advanced, as it is called, so far. They did not hate dwarves especially, no more than they hated everybody and everything, and particularly the orderly and prosperous. In some parts, wicked dwarves had even made alliances with them. But they had a special grudge against Thorin's people because of the war which you have heard mentioned and which does not come into this tale. And anyway, goblins don't care who they catch, as long as it's done smart and secret, and the prisoners are not able to defend themselves. The prisoners not being able to defend themselves might be another piece of evidence in the argument that the dwarves were not carrying weapons prior to the discovery of 3 elven swords in the trollish horde. So we're getting here, right, direct comparisons and indirect comparisons. They are being positioned as simply the bad kind of dwarves, and there are fairy tale precedences for that. There is a long-running kind of, the problem with fairy tale terminology, of course, is that if you go back far enough and in the right direction, you can find basically any definition attached to any kind of word. We talked before in the Silmarillion series about how the elves of Beleriand in particular were first conceived as, the Noldor, I guess, particularly, were first conceived as gnomes in that kind of fairy tale tradition. And we're seeing some of that same kind of old mythic fairy tale kind of stylization taking place here, aesthetically, if nothing else, between the goblins and the dwarves. They make no beautiful things, but they make many clever ones. We have talked so often in our discussions of Tolkien's work about crafting and about the creation of things and about how we can tell the positive creative impulse from the negative creative impulse, right? That oftentimes it is about jealousy. It is about keeping for yourself the thing that you have made, see Fëanor and the Silmarils, right? Or the thing that you have discovered, see The King Under the Mountain and the Arkenstone. We can see the similar kinds of patterns evolving there. Dragon sickness in its general form, I suppose, right? We'll have opportunity to talk about that later in this book. But there is also this idea of craft and pride and a good positive intention. It is clear from the inference here that partly the things that goblins create are bad because they are created with bad intent, rather, right? Pickaxes, tongs, instruments of torture they make very well or get other people to make to their design. There is an idea that they are evil not just because of the purposes to which they are put, but they are partly evil in the intent of their creation. That is most clear, I think, when we get to this idea clearly added into this narrative by the modern narrator, by the Tolkien avatar that we get behind the text of this book. But this idea of ingenious devices for killing large numbers of people at once, for wheels and engines and explosions always delighted them, and not working with their own hands more than they could help, right? Two pillars of Tolkien's opposition to modernity and industry, right? These are key parts of his... Well, we can think about this very clearly in terms of the Scouring of the Shire. Two of the things that we see as we move into the Scouring of the Shire are the removal of personal agency, the removal of the ability and the encouragement to work with one's own hands, the idea that we want to be as present in the process, the creative process, the agrarian process as possible, and that machines are effectively dehumanizing, and also this idea that machines separated from their users, machines built to their own purpose and their own continuation, are also inherently bad, inherently destructive. Destructive, as we see in the Scouring of the Shire, of the environment, certainly, but also of the human spirit. There is an element of work that is good for one, as true for the working class hobbits of the Shire as it is for Merry, Pippin, and Frodo. So this comparison, I think, plays out really beautifully here because it allows us to see what makes the dwarves virtuous and valorous in opposition. We're not just told that the dwarves are good. This is all going to come back to us when we get to the Lonely Mountain, of course. But we are told that the goblins are bad because they are unlike dwarves. So we get this kind of like exploration of the immediate circumstances in which we find ourselves narratively, right? The plot is still moving forward, but we're also getting a better insight, a more mature insight, a more sophisticated insight into the dwarves, into the company in which Bilbo now finds himself, that they are skilled, but that skill is used with care, that they are dedicated, right? They are committed craftspeople, but that the product of the craft and the process of their craft is itself beautiful. You don't get the sense, as hammers are falling like ringing bells, right? You don't get the sense that a dwarven workshop is a place of chaos and mess and disorder. It is a place of order. That is one of the reasons that the goblins hate the dwarves. We're explicitly told. If I can find that on the slide in front of me. They did not hate dwarves especially, no more than they hated everybody and everything, and particularly the orderly and prosperous, right? That is one of the things that is creating a friction here. Also, we're alluding to the Dwarf Goblin War and that culminates in the Battle of Azanulbazar. Yes, exactly. Glad Rebecca's saying, and now AI people don't even want to work with their own minds anymore. I mean, I would say that it would be fascinating to know what Professor Tolkien would think of AI, but I think that we all know what Professor Tolkien would think of AI. I think that he would be dispirited by it. The last point that I want to make, because it is 10 o'clock already and I have to wrap up and go and get ready for Last Call at the Green Dragon, where I'm sure this conversation will continue apace. The last point that I want to make here is an important one, not so much for The Hobbit because of because of that fairy tale framework, right? Because of the aesthetic regime that we're bringing to our understanding of how these different fantasy races are being positioned. But certainly as we look at orcs in The Lord of the Rings, and as we kind of extend those out into the Silmarillion and the broader legendarium, it is worth remembering here that Tolkien within this frame is crediting to the goblins the creation of weapons, which he of course knows in real life were created by people. It's very tempting, right? Tolkien is absolutely guilty of some race essentialism, as I've said before. He's guilty of falling into some patterns, into some modes of thought that are inculcated within him by his, 19th century schooling, his very early 20th century schooling too, I'm sure, right? This notion of race theory, this idea that race is in fact a real thing that is definitive of one's nature, that is definitive of one's physical and mental character, intellectual character, right? Which is, we know now, nonsense. They didn't know that at the time. And Tolkien is, as I say, guilty of this kind of essentialism. Dwarves are like this, elves are like this, hobbits are like this. This is not a thing that a responsible person would do in 2025. But the point is this. Though we can acknowledge that essentialism is real and prevalent in the pages of Professor Tolkien's work, we also have to acknowledge that he rarely situates us, the modern world, right? His readers, his community, his nation in particular, he rarely situates us incontrovertibly on the good side of things. There are, as he says to Christopher, orcs on both sides. That's really, I think, the encapsulation of his perspective. So when he is talking about the evil races of the East, when he is talking about the valor of the West, when he's talking about orcs, when he's talking about Ents, when he's talking about all the various races and all the different kind of modalities of thought that we get into as we identify and categorize and pin those races to the corkboard as though they were identifying characteristics. As we're moving through all of that, it is worth remembering that these things are a product of a different perspective, a flawed perspective on how the world really works, but they have little to say about fundamental morality. The heroes that we follow are heroes because they are heroes, not because they are the particular races that we see, right? The closest that we get to a perfect race are the elves. And even then, very far from perfect. If you read the Silmarillion, you kind of know what I'm talking about, right? Also capable of some of the greatest evil and cruelty and recklessness and bloodshed that we see in the entire book. So all of that is to say, you always have to be mindful of this. I wish that we didn't have to be mindful of it, but we do as responsible Tolkien readers here in the 21st century. There is race essentialism, but it's never as simple as you think it is. It's always more complicated, more crunchy, more interesting, and we'll probably have the opportunity to talk about that never again in the pages of this book. Probably when we get to The Lord of the Rings, though, we'll have some more to talk about. All right, that is going to do it for tonight. Let me... I didn't even prepare a final slide with the schedule for next week, but it doesn't matter because next week, August 19th, back on Tuesday next week, I do apologize for the delay in the production of tonight's episode, but next Tuesday night, 9 p.m. Central Time, Riddles in the Dark. I don't know how we're going to fit all of that chapter into 1 hour of podcasting. We're going to do the best that we can, I guess, but I really do want to look at each riddle in turn. I want to look at the schematic as it's presented to us of Gollum's life, Gollum's experience, Goblin's, right? If we're talking about, right, racial essentialism, what does that get us for Gollum of all people? What is it that Tolkien's leaning on as he's creating this character? And of course, how does he revise this character between the 1937 first edition and the 1951 second edition, which is made compatible with The Lord of the Rings, the revelation of Bilbo's true story of what really happened. You can imagine the BuzzFeed article right now, right? The true story of what really happened deep below the Misty Mountains. One ring that will surprise you. That is going to do it for Shire Reckoning. I have to... bounce out of here. Join me in 10 minutes over on the Patreon page. Oh, I should mention, patreon.com/nextword is the first thing that I should say. And then I should say, because I've had some inquiries and I am at best a B+ podcaster and God knows a C- self-promoter, those extra bonus episodes, the last call, the Green Dragon bonus episodes that I do every week are all over there on the Patreon page. If you go and join the Patreon page, you get the entire back catalog of those podcasts and every other bonus podcast that I have done since I started Next Word almost 2 years ago. There's like 75 episodes over there. There's a lot of stuff. But the last call at the Green Dragons will persist. We've done 3 so far. We're going to do another one tonight. We will see how that goes. Thank you to everyone for listening, for joining me here live. Glad Rebecca, Glorfin, David, Chris, thank you so much for being here tonight. It was an absolute blast and a pleasure to spend the evening with you. Thank you, everyone listening at home, for supporting independent, ad-free media and God knows criticism. This week has been a tough week if you work as a critic out there in the world. And we have to remember that stories are pillars of our society. Stories are not the only thing, but they are a necessary thing. And understanding stories, encouraging this kind of joyous and celebratory media literacy, which is the thing that I try and do behind this microphone 5 times a week, continuing to do this is so important. Not just my work, of course, but the work of far more gifted and talented scholars and critics, academics, journalists, communicators out there in the world. It's a really difficult time for these industries right now. And though I do believe it will become a better time, I don't know exactly when that will happen. So my best wishes go out to everybody who lost their jobs from several previously august institutions this week, and my fervent hopes that we can continue to keep the fires of criticism and conversation alive into the future. I'll be here behind this mic doing my part. Thanks so much for listening. I will talk to many of you over at the Green Dragon in just a few minutes, or I'll see you all on Sunday for the next Topics show, I guess is what we're calling that now. Thanks so much for listening. I'll talk to you